Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Shannon Lausch, President of the Pulaski County Historical Society. Before today's lecture begins, I'd like to encourage everyone to become a member of the Society. You can sign up on our website at pulaskicountyhistory.org. Members receive the Society's Pulaski County Historical Review, our quarterly journal. Today's presenter is Michael Hood, and he'll be discussing Arkansas statehood and Little Rock in 1836.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I guess you can hear me just fine. I see we got a few folks here, some loyal members of the Pulaski County Historical Society with us today. You might remember I did a talk in 2016 similar to this, but different. Think of this as part 2 of what life was like in 1836 around the time of statehood. A little bit about some of the early days of the territory, a little bit leading up to the Civil War. The last presentation I did was the first one I did as a WebEx type of presentation, and it was essentially a story of the forgotten dead of the Insane Asylum Cemetery, the State Insane Asylum. I eventually got over 150 hits on YouTube, which kind of surprised me. And proves once and for all that I really do have a small but deeply disturbed following. I got that from an old show. It was a 1980s movie called The Big Chill, when actor Will Hurt was talking about his days as a disc jockey in Los Angeles. He told him I had a small but deeply disturbed following. I miss having an audience instead of a WebEx, but that's fine. We're going to get through this. You know me. If you know me well enough to know I'd have to say something about trains while I'm here today. It seems like so long ago, but I got my start with Pulaski County Historical Society in 2010 when I did a presentation of research I did on the Little Rock, Maumelle, and Western Railroad in the Niemeyer Lumber Camp, Niemeyer Lumber Company. And this is a photo of one of the Shea engines, one of the smaller tram engines that was used extensively in the woods of Western Pulaski County for logging. They'd pull small train loads of logs up to the main line sidings and pull them out to downtown Little Rock. Well, not downtown, what was then the edge of Little Rock at Elm Street, to a large sawmill there. And I love that talk. I did that talk 13 times before I quit getting any calls to come and hear it anymore. Speaking of trains, did you know the first train to operate in Arkansas was the Memphis and Little Rock Railroad? But it took years, I mean decades, for the thing from its initial conception and charter to actually get the thing built. Even leading up into the Civil War, it was not completed. In 1851, it started construction, or at least the charter was made and the plans were made. And by 1862, only 2/3 of it were actually in operation. One part near Memphis and one part near Little Rock, with the middle third being uncompleted, mainly because of the difficulty of crossing all the major rivers, the St. Francis, the Lingell, and the White. So they had skipped the hard part and done the two ends, but it ends up to be a very valuable resource for Little Rock, because steamboat travel in those days was not reliable on the Arkansas, but was much more reliable on the White. And so it was instrumental during the Civil War for both sides to have that extra river port at the White River, and then load goods onto the train and bring them into Little Rock. There was no bridge at that time, so the main station was on the other side of the river in what's today North Little Rock, then called Huntersville. I love an account of what it was like in those years to go from Little Rock to Memphis. They would have to depart Little Rock, you'd first get on the ferry and ride across, walk down to the train station, get on the train, ride the train to Duval's Bluff, get off the train, get on a steamboat, ride the steamboat southeasterly to Clarendon, get off, get on a stagecoach, ride the stagecoach, and cross several ferry crossings to get to the end of the railroad line towards the Memphis side, get on the train, go to the Mississippi River, get on a ferry, Go across the ferry, and at last you're in Memphis. 2 days travel. So what's that take today? What, about 2.5 hours? Is that what it takes running down the highway? Let's remember every now and then how good we've actually got it. Name that tune. This should be easy for the audience I see participating today. But I wanted to go ahead and play a little old version of a song that was quite popular in these years, especially the later. And there you go, the Arkansas Traveler. That song was quite popular in the late 1800s, starting about 1840, I believe was the date. Uh, and out of it came, of course, a wonderful story and a play, uh, quite humorous. It was a satire at Arkansas, and many say that it had a lot to do with giving Arkansas a hillbilly backward reputation that endured for years after, and that it was probably more harmful to the state than it ever was good to have that notoriety of that play and that song. But still, I think it's fun to remember that old song and those old days and the story of the Arkansas Traveler. If I had a little more time now is when I'd go into baseball for you and talk about the Arkansas Traveler baseball team. But I thought I'd better move along. What you're seeing on the next slide is post roads and distances in about 1824. And if you'll note, Arkansas is bigger. Yes, for a time, we had part of what's today Oklahoma or Indian Territory included with Arkansas. In 1824, of course, this would be the territory of Arkansas, not the state. And by this time, very recently, the capital of Arkansas Territory had moved from the Arkansas Post to Little Rock after a lot of finagling and competition on where the future capital Little Rock would be, where would be the seat of territorial government. There was actually a lot of competition across the river at Crystal Hill. Crystal Hill was a town in its own right and thought to be much more refined and a much better suited place than Little Rock for a capital. It was located about where the golf course is today over in Maumelle. And Crystal Hill Road is probably one of the oldest roads in the state, gets its name from that early settlement of Crystal Hill. And in these same early years, Cadron was the Pulaski County seat. If you take a look at the map too, you can see there's a grid pattern shown in the eastern portion of the state. All through this area, what you're seeing is a representation of how far the survey, the initial survey of Arkansas had gotten in 1824. In order to sell land and attract settlers, they had to have a survey done, they had to have legal descriptions so people could get a proper deed and have a proper homestead and place to live. This is all the further the surveyor got at that point, and part of the reason was in this area, right, I'm going to zoom in a little bit there. Oh, wrong slide. Part of that reason of that is in this area up here was actually the Cherokee boundary where Native Americans were given that land by treaty. So in a sense, in these early years, this is all the further that they would legally sell land. There's not much there. There's not much there. Not much at all when you look at it. Not many towns, even if you zoom in, it's still a very wild and sparsely populated place. One of the first settlers to come to the area around Little Rock was in 1807, and that was the Payette families that come from North Carolina. They were very adventurous for the time because the territory was still quite wild. Uh, they settled north of the river in the area of Crystal Hill, and they were so isolated that a few years later, about a year later, they were surprised that other families were living across the river from them in what today is probably the area of the Little Maumelle River, Two Rivers Park, Old Roland on the river. And those old families, it was written, was a group of unrepentant Tories. And I thought that was kind of a funny expression. Tories, of course, being a reference to those that sided with the king during the Revolutionary War. A lot of Tories fled the United States, the new colonies after the end of the Revolutionary War. Many stayed, but they were driven into the wilderness just for their own safety and just to get away. And they were among, like the French, some of the earliest settlers in Arkansas. I'm an engineer. I can't help it. I have to show you a survey too. This is an early survey, 1855. This wasn't the earliest survey of Little Rock area, but it was a resurvey. So many people had started to come into the state by 1855. We were a state now. There was conflicting land claims. So in general, the United States ordered a resurvey of much of the state of Arkansas, especially those areas that had seen significant population growth, to better establish corners, land claims, and where things should lie. What you're seeing here is this red line, this larger area, would be what was known as the original city of Little Rock. It was platted in about 1835, and it encompassed a fairly large area. So large that it would take years for the city to grow and fill that whole boundary with houses, developments, that roads were completed. It wasn't until long after the Civil War in about 1888 that that part of the city ever really fully developed. But they certainly had ambition. They laid that down as the boundaries of the first city in the state of Arkansas, the city of Little Rock. If you zoom in a little bit, there's a little bit of detail here that I think is kind of fun. You've got the old State House on the river up on the north near the Arkansas. Down below this little square here, cemetery, there's your Mount Holly Cemetery. And this red line is what the original town of Little Rock was, starting in about 1820 and formally made into a town in about 1835, I believe was the date. At that time, the cemetery was outside of the town of Little Rock, very close to Holly Street. So I've often wondered if Mount Holly is a reference to the old Holly Street that was platted with the town of Little Rock. You can see here Major Watkins Place, and over here on the side, 3 blocks of property of notable early landowners. People had very early land claims to this area. In the very fancy cursive writing, you see Mrs. Trapnell, Colonel Fowler's place, and Captain Pike, a reference to Albert Pike, who's got some more to do in this little story I've got for you today. Arkansas River commerce was king. It was what it was all about. It was the best way to travel. Overland routes were rough, poorly improved. In about 1820, the first work began on improving old trails. One of the old trails and the first official federal road to pass through Little Rock was the military road that came through Arkansas on the route from St. Louis down to Fulton in the southwest corner of the state, and the road to Texas. All the ferry boats, the river boats, the steamboats tied up mostly around Commerce Street. And of course, Ferry Street was the location of the ferry. And we also had Water and Elm Streets very close to the river, two streets running parallel to the river where all the commerce went on. And incidentally, that was also referred to by many writers and people of the time as Hell's Half Acre. If you picture Little Rock, and you can kind of see from the picture that, Little Rock was a rough and wild frontier town. Most of the early settlers that came here seeking their fortune came here out of the War of 1812, and they were soldiers, they were officers during that war. They were offered bounties of land. They would be given 160 acres for fighting in that war. And they were given the option, you can pick any 160 you want and claim it and settle it, or you can sell a certificate to someone else and keep the cash. A lot of them did sell their certificates, and that caused a big land speculation that continued on for years and years after, and also resulted in a lot of different conflicting claims and problems, but that's the way it was at the time. There were several visitors in the early days that would write of Arkansas. George Fanshawe was one of them in 1838. His name is actually spelled Featherstone Haw. What a name, but I'm told that it's pronounced Fanshawe. I believe that was in one of our Pulaski County articles here just lately. Old George had this to say: in his estimation, Little Rock had fewer than 12 citizens who refrained from wearing 2 pistols and a Bowie knife at all times. I remember another account that I read that was very interesting, or at least made me laugh a little bit, about a traveler that come to the local hotel in Little Rock and went to the dining hall. And when they went in there, all the people that are dining would sit down at the tables and put a gun or a knife on the table while they ate. And the traveler, she was quite concerned about it and inquired to the hostess, are we expecting trouble tonight? And the hostess laughed and says, oh, not at all. There'll be no trouble here. So apparently it was important to be armed at all times, at least in those early years of the territorial days. In 1838, the German adventurer and hunter Frederick Gerstacker, I hope I pronounced his name right, had a little poem he wrote in his writings. Boatmen on the Mississippi have good reason when they sing, Little Rock in Arkansas, damnedest place I ever saw. In 1836, when Little Rock became a state, there wasn't much here. It had a population of about 600 and about 150 buildings. This is a drawing that's said to have been a fairly accurate representation of what Little Rock was like and its extents. I've zoomed in a little bit with this picture here, but there wasn't a lot else to it. There was a scattering of buildings along the Arkansas River, and off into the distance you can see small farmsteads dotted here and there across the landscape. What's remarkable to me about this, though, is that this drawing, it has a population of 600 people in a brand new state capital. Amazing. The little town that my mother lived in Iowa, in northern rural Iowa, had 756 friendly people and 1 old grump, and it was a little bitty place. Little Rock had 600 homes. Commerce was existent. Certainly everybody needed goods and supplies to live. There had to be a way to sell it. This is the picture of the Badget Block as it appeared in 1866. When you read the word block, it referred to a very large building. It wasn't necessarily a block like in the physical survey sense of a block of streets. It was a reference to a very large building. And for this time, this is one of the busiest and most notable business establishments in the whole city. And as you can see, it's a series of just small doors going into each little establishment or office with an upstairs room. Industry was limited. There was no extensive industry in Arkansas at the time of statehood. Agriculture was king, cotton was king, much as you already know. But I thought this old ad was interesting. Different collection of clippings from local newspapers of what they did manufacture here and sell. And if you look over the list, it's a saddlery and harness shop, furniture of all types, tables, bedsteads, mattresses, chairs, imported and manufactured on the site. Tin and sheet metal goods, iron and copper, you know, they needed kettles. They've got a still pictured here in one of the pictures. There's one of the old-fashioned stills. Certainly you can't get away from the fact that whiskey was very popular amongst all the population, virtually all the population. They had buggies and carriage manufacturers. They had some heavy industry to the extent that they built machinery to build their own gins and sawmills, that kind of stuff. A notable early resident, George Brodie, Brodie is actually how the family pronounced his name, advertised himself extensively as being capable of building mill machinery of all types. And you can see here an ad for a new foundry. Arkansas, Little Rock had a very important foundry in the early years, several of them. Arkansas Foundry Company, AFCO, being the largest one, and still a notable name in this city. When you hear AFCO, its roots go way back. And a planer mill. How did they live? Well, for the most part, they lived in log cabins, and that's what it was all about. Hiram Whittington of Hot Springs fame wrote in his journals that in 1827, now we've gone back just a little bit before statehood, the town of Little Rock consisted of just 60 buildings, 6 brick, 8 frame, and the balance log cabins, about 430 residents. Still a small place. And if you notice, out of those 60 buildings, there was a lot of log cabins. This photo here is a photo I got from the Territorial Restoration, the Arkansas Historic Museum. What I like about it and what is true to life is that many of the homes in the early years occupied an entire block of land, or a half block, and included several outbuildings. Especially they would have a kitchen, maybe a carriage house, a stables. They might have a milking parlor or barn, as the expression is, and fenced enclosures for gardens of all type, orchards. It was just small urban farmsteads was what Little Rock was all about. This is a picture of the dog trot style cabin I always liked. It has a central breezeway with a room on each side. Typically one room might be the kitchen or kind of a living area. In the winter, they'd gather up there around the warm fire, and in the summer, they'd go to the other side to get away from that heat. And they frequently just slept in the same rooms they lived in. Brick houses were rare, as you could saw from, I am so sorry. I thought I turned my phone off. The Brownlee House, another example from the Territorial Restoration, was constructed in 1840 and was one of the few brick homes at the time. There were some other brick homes, of course. William Woodruff had one. Early Territorial Governor George Izard had a small home. He walked from a small brick home where he lived just a few blocks down the street to a log office. You know, I keep getting notices from the city of Little Rock. I'm not sure what's so important. And the bricks were made here in Little Rock. It was too expensive to transport them, although certainly some people imported brick. Some of the earliest brick yards were down along the Push River. And at that location, there were several different brick plants over the years. A very large and notable one was Arkansas Brick and Manufacturing, later known as the Dickenson Brickworks. And that was eventually bought up by Acme Brick. It was operated for a time and closed down, and their operations consolidated at Perla, Arkansas. But they certainly did make their own brick here and did construct some brick homes, some very notable fine brick homes in the later years. And an example of a wood frame building, the Mcvicker House, is also a Territorial Restoration example. These were often referred to. Frame houses proliferated after the first sawmill went into operation at the foot of Spring Street. At the foot of Spring Street was a notable year-round spring, and plenty of water supply to run boilers. And that was the first steam powered mill that I know of that was built in the city to supply lumber. And so frame houses proliferated. It was an affordable option for the working class folks of the city. And they were referred to as Shingle Palaces, being very cheaply constructed, typically with just 2-inch lap siding on the outside, boards on the inside with a heavy wallpaper and a shingle roof. And that was it. But of course, that was a lot better being on a wood floor off the ground than being in a log hut. I thought I'd say something about Chester Ashley. He was a very prominent attorney and landowner. He made his fortune in real estate speculation, real estate dealings. He had a very fine reputation, but he also had been in his lifetime a little bit of trouble, accused of suborning perjury in one case as an attorney, and accused of some dirty land dealings from time to time. Nevertheless, he was a powerful force and a friend to many of the powerful politicians at the time, and he was also the third U.S. Senator from Arkansas. He practiced law in a brief partnership with Robert S. Crittenden, another very notable character for that time, and later went on to practice law with another early an important man, George Watkins, who was the Chief Justice of the Arkansas Supreme Court when they joined forces. And later, Uriah M. Rose joined the firm, and you might know that name from the Rose Law Firm. Other notable partners, and there were many, included Dedrick Harold Cantrell. And just lately, there was an article that Dr. Clark and I worked on the history of Dedrick Harold Cantrell. Ashley's home was the finest. I've given you some examples of probably how most of the people lived at that time in Little Rock, but the Ashley home was described by Governor John Pope at the time as an old-time seat of refinement and hospitality. He wrote of the manor that it was a large 2-story brick mansion built after the Greek style of architecture with high brick columns, stuccoed in imitation stone. It seems that it was quite popular at the time, and the early coverings of the State House also was stuccoed and scored to look like stone, and several other public buildings and private buildings likewise had that treatment. The splendid residence and its trimly kept gardens, orchard, conservatory, hothouse, servant quarters, stables, carriage house, and many other buildings marked its owner, Chester Ashley, is a man of wealth and elegance. It became, during the Civil War and the occupation by the Union, the headquarters of Major General Frederick Steele. What did they drink? Well, I thought I'd cover everything. I was going to give you a little taste of what life was like in Little Rock at the time of statehood in 1836, so I think we need to spend a minute anyway on the water supplies. Our water supply in those early years came entirely from wells, cisterns, and springs. Now, Little Rock was blessed a little bit in that respect. What you can see here is a cistern with a small structure on it for pumping water back up out of the cistern. The cistern is an underground reservoir, typically a cylindrical well shape deep into the ground. And the pipe you can see here was part of a system to catch water from the roofs of all the buildings in rain and route it to the cistern where it was saved and drawn later for cooking and drinking. Little Rock was blessed with many springs, and many people don't know that. And that comes up every now and then with owners of downtown buildings that still to this day have trouble keeping their basements dry. Main Street used to have a surprising number of major springs coming out of the ground all through the area. Even just lately, when the city went in and did a sidewalk project down there, we had to capture and route some of that spring water into the storm sewers to try to control the flow. Other early springs, there was important ones all over, were all along Swaggerty Branch, Martin Luther King Drive. That whole corridor down through there was filled with notable large springs. And there were several other important springs in East Little Rock. Those springs continued in use almost continually into the 30s, and some of them beyond that. Spring water, you would go typically and purchase it, much like we drink bottled water now. Some springs were free. You could go fill up your jugs from them. But it was very important to have a good supply of spring water right up until later years. The reason being, even when Little Rock did begin development of, say, a public or a multi-user water supply, the water quality is poor. It came out of the Arkansas River. It was there mostly for firefighting. So many wood buildings in such a concentration, all of them using wood heat or coal heat. Fire was a big danger. So the early construction of water systems in Little Rock had more to do with firefighting than anything to do with drinking water. It wasn't until 1938 that Little Rock actually bought out the last private water company and actually had its own municipal water company, I guess you could say, municipal water supply and operation. And finally, we had a reliable, safe, and wonderful drinking water source with the construction of Lake Winona in far western, well, that'd be Saline County, in about middle Saline County. And if we're going to talk water, shouldn't we talk a little something about sewer? The town branch. Bill Worthen, this was his topic. He did a lot of research on it, gave a wonderful, wonderful talk on this down at the Arkansas Historic Museum in the auditorium. And I took my lovely wife, Charlotte, with me to that. And she sat through the lecture, and it was very humorous. He's a wonderful speaker. And when it was all done, we were on our way out to the car, and my wife goes, "So that's your idea of a Sunday afternoon date? Take me to a lecture on sewers?" Well, she had a good point. So I tried ever since to just pick and choose what I'm going to take her in. Our first sewerage system was the town branch, as simple as that. Everybody had privies, and some of them didn't bother to construct a privy. And I assume everybody understands a privy is a wooden outside house where you go to the bathroom. The big ones were two-holers. Most of them were just one-holer. They were built on small lots too close to the springs and the wells I just talked about. Some of them, the ground didn't percolate well, so they didn't function well. They would tend to overflow, or they would just dig a little shallow ditch out to the town branch to drain it away. They would have maybe a small pan that they would take to bed or keep in the house when they needed to go to the bathroom, and then just throw that out into the town branch when it got full. It wasn't a big problem in the early years of Little Rock as a state because there just wasn't that many people living here. But over time, it got to be a problem. It got to be a big problem to the point that in 1851, excuse me, let me back up a little, where this drained out the town branch beyond the developed part of the town, which is about Bird and Collins Street in those years. That'd be about just the first couple of blocks east of the Interstate 30 highway. It entered a large swamp. And Little Rock out towards the Clinton Library and towards what's now Lost 40 Brewing Company and the East End area there, what's called the East End very recently, was all swampy low ground. The railroads hadn't come through yet and built their facilities. It was just pretty wild and hard to deal with. When the Arkansas River got high, the Push River would rise with it, and the Push would back up into Town Branch all the way up to Collins or Sherman Street. Sherman Street is what's referenced, which would be about right in here somewhere. And it backed up so much that they caught buffalo fish from the river weighing up to 15 pounds in that little bitty branch. The first efforts at any kind of organized flood control for the town branch came with the construction in 1851 of a dam on the Push River, and that would be very close to where the Push Dam Pike and Roosevelt Road meet today. And that's how Push Dam Pike got its name, because there was a dam constructed on the Push River to keep the Arkansas River from backing up into the Push and backing up into the town and pushing all that nasty filth back into the city. And so that was their first attempt at flood control. I don't think it worked very well. You don't see many references to it. By the time the Civil War had come and gone, something had to be done about this old town branch. And it was written, excuse me one moment, it was written that right in the heart of the city is one of the most malignant, pestiferous disease breeders in the land. The town branch, or whatever poetic title you may apply to this muddy, filthy stream that penetrates directly through the city, is the root of evil. Open to the rays of the burning sun in summer, the reeking filth from barnyard and cesspool and worse lie festering and tainting the atmosphere with disease, death, and odor. Covered in places by boards, right in our business streets, hide the reeking stench beneath. The death-dealing gases escape, and little innocents wither and die. The strong men sicken and gasp. That is certainly a poetic description. That was finally solved through a series of cutoffs of deep underground tunnels that are still there to this day. They're brick arch tunnels that drained the town branch directly to the river, and once and for all dried all that up. And eventually over time, long after this period of time, why sewerage systems were constructed and sewer treatment plants. And much into the modern world we go. And speaking of sewers, I want to put this slide in real quick. Right there is the arch of Arch Street, right next to City Hall. This would be where City Hall is constructed. It would come to be constructed in about 1903. But Arch Street gets a name from an old stone arch, and there was a big ravine, a drainage ravine that went up through here and through the stone arch and out to the river. I'd speculated, I wouldn't think they would go demolish that. I'd think that there must be some of that underground. It's all covered up today. It's all gone. And just lately, there was a sinkhole developed out in Markham Street. And of course, our crews had to come in, the crews with the city of Little Rock had to come in and work on that. And they started talking that they went into a manhole and crawled through a 3-foot pipe for about 25 foot and came out into a chamber that was about 9 feet tall. And it was a very large chamber under Markham Street. Well, darned if that isn't what you're seeing here in this drawing of 1887. The old arch of Arch Street is still buried underground and is still part of the city's drainage system. Fun little trivia, at least it is to me. Guns N' Roses, the rock band Guns N' Roses came to Little Rock on August 9th, 2017. Did you know that the city of Little Rock was once known as the City of Roses, and it was for quite a number of years? Named so called for the many beautiful gardens and rose plantings that were all along in public and private homes and businesses. It was quite beautiful around the cemeteries, both cemeteries, Oakland and around Oakland and Fraternal and around Mount Holly. There was extensive rose plantings. And so it was quite a beautiful city of roses. I even have a little gift from some of my folks there. It's supposed to be blue and white, but Little Rock, City of Roses, 1962. They had a propensity towards violence, and I thought I'd tell you something about early police efforts. In 1835 was the first time, and that was quite a long time. Little Rock really started getting settled and constructed in earnest in 1820. But for 15 years, the only law enforcement was officers of the territorial government, the federal marshal's office mainly. Before that, there was no law as such in Little Rock. Certainly there was folks that would try to keep order. But the first formal constable came in 1835. The Charter of 1835 from the territorial government, we weren't quite a state yet, provided that there would be election by the people who would elect a constable, and he shall be the ex officio tax collector and attend to the courts. There was only one constable. The longest serving one in the early years was Constable Henry Griffin. He served all the way until the federal occupation of Little Rock during the Civil War. He was allowed to keep half the fines that he collected of the convictions he got in court. And it was no small item. It was quite a lot of money, and he was able to afford a number of deputies and did a fairly good job keeping law and order. But it was also a job that apparently made him quite wealthy over the years. I guess so, if you get to keep half the fines. There was also later elections of two magistrates, judges, if you will, who would judge the petty crimes, and those magistrates were part of this law system in these early years. Oh, here's a funny story I like. Griffin, in the early years, didn't have his own jail, and so he was reluctant to arrest anybody. He didn't really have a place to put them. In fact, he was known to have taken lawbreakers home and just leaving them there with an order to appear in court at an appointed time. Even said that he would take and load a drunk up in a wheelbarrow, push him home, dump him in the yard, and stuff a writ in his pocket, ordered him to appear on his appointed day for court. Later, he constructed a stone jail on the banks of the Arkansas River, and it was written that an angry mob assembled and tore that stone jail down. Now, I don't know what they were angry about or what that might be, but that sure is an intriguing thought. December 8, 1838, the General Assembly finally passes an act for the establishment of the first state penitentiary. That penitentiary was located where the current Arkansas Capitol is located at, and that is the hill in prominence in this drawing. I think it's a fine drawing. There's some old, faded, poor pictures from the Civil War era of the penitentiary on the hill, but this drawing, I think, is a very nice depiction of what it was like. You're seeing here the stone wall in the background behind the single tree there, and you're seeing there is a guard tower at the corner of the walls on each end, another one in the middle, and the penitentiary, the main penitentiary building right here in the middle. I thought it was remarkable that it took till 1838, though, to have any kind of a penitentiary system in the state, 2 years after statehood. Robert Crittenden, first territorial secretary, and he was a powerful political force. He arrived in the territory at Arkansas Post long before the first governor, Governor James Miller, arrived, and he immediately took power, began assembling a group around him of appointees and political allies, and was a major force in the early territorial politics. He was a big supporter in the early years of Henry W. Conway, who was territorial delegate, that being the highest and only office of a territorial representative at the United States Congress. So the territorial delegate certainly held a lot of power, and certainly was quite important in those years. Crittenden supported Conway, but in a strange twist of fate, challenged Conway to a duel and killed him over some bitter feelings over the delegate election, the second one. Crittenden felt like he'd been double-crossed, that Conway had agreed he would not run again for territorial delegate, that he would leave that to Crittenden, and somehow that never happened. If you remember some of my other talks, dueling was quite common in those years, and it was something that was opposed by many, including Governor John Pope. And there's Crittenden's house. Now, I did show you Ashley's mansion, but that came much later. Ashley's first home was quite small, much smaller, 1.5-story brick home that was enlarged and improved over and over and over the years till you see that photo around the time of the Civil War that I just showed you. In the early days of the territory, by far the finest home in town was Robert Crittenden's home. It had tall ceilings, very large rooms, It was a suitable meeting place in many ways on account of its very large rooms. And Critton had enough political power, enough political force to go down to the territorial session and get legislation passed to swap his home for 10 sections of land that the federal government had granted to the territorial government to raise money for the construction of a state house and a penitentiary. Well, as you can see, they didn't get the penitentiary done, but they did get the state house done. Governor Pope vetoed that legislation, exchanging that Crittenden's home for those 10 sections of land. And as you can see from the figures, it was never a good deal. It was a bald-faced political maneuver to get Crittenden out of a big debt he owned. He needed the money desperately. That land was sold for $30,000, more than enough money to build the state house with some minor supplemental appropriation. But his house, after his death, sold out of foreclosure to one of his political enemies for $6,700. John Pope was the governor around the time of Crittenden who vetoed that legislation. He had high hopes for improving Arkansas's reputation and worked on that continually. He wrote in those years briefly about, in the early days of any country, no matter how intelligent, refined, or honorable this better class of people were, there were to be found men of lawless and desperate character who had to be met with force and swift justice. Besides this want of action and constant occupation and great interest taken in local politics, of quarrels growing out of some real or fancied wrong or disputes over a piece of land or other property, these instances often led to bloody encounters. Sometimes they were decided on the field of honor, falsely so called, and at others resulted in a rough and tumble fight or a shooting and cutting scrape. Arkansas was no worse in this respect than any other new state, nor was she any better than her neighbors. I've always liked the guy, but he wasn't universally popular. But I thought he did a lot for our state when I read back over everything. Eventually, the state house was finished, although not until some of the years after 1836, when Arkansas became a state. It was still under construction and still in quite a crude state in the early days of the meeting of the new state legislature. But nonetheless, the buildings finally did get completed and was a fine example, was a fine leading example of buildings, the finest in the city, finest perhaps in the state at that time. And in honor of the completion of that building, the streets on either side of it were named for Chester Ashley and Conway. Arkansas politics were dominated in the early years by the family. I thought that sounded so mafioso, so gangster sounding. I'm sure they were refined and wonderful people, but from Surveyor General Henry Rector and all the many appointments he made to different offices in the territory that started a line of political influence, to different interconnected marriages in the Johnson family, the Sevier family, and the Conway family, James being the cousin of Henry Conway. They controlled politics for many years, all the way through to the end of the Civil War, into the Reconstruction time. And there's no doubt that they certainly did represent at that time the plantation or the planter aspects of the state more so than maybe the small farmers of the western part of the state. But they certainly hold great sway over the state in those early years. William Fulton was the last territorial governor and one of the first U.S. senators. He argued forcefully for that Arkansas was not ready for statehood. He made mostly a technical argument on the basis of different treaties and the purchase parameters and prior congressional legislation that said Arkansas was just not ready for statehood. Many others, there was many other reasons. He and others argued at the time about it, and it was a very unpopular position to take. And why what otherwise would be a savvy politician would say Arkansas is just not ready. Well, why not ready? These items here are not necessarily Fulton's items. There's items that other historians have mentioned numerous times when you look through the literature of the past. But Arkansas had such a small population, had few public institutions or private institutions for that matter. It had no organized banking system. The state went off into banking briefly after statehood, but at that time there was only minor, small banks. There was no railroad system at the time of statehood. There was a poor road system, although construction of that system had begun with the military and post roads. It was a long way to go till road travel was comfortable. There was no penitentiary in 1836. There was a limited kind of measly volunteer militia. There was little industry other than some of the local cottage industries I mentioned that supported just basic living and accommodation. And there was a very limited education system. Any education, college education, anybody to be college educated had to go out of state. And there was limited private institutions for education. You had to have at least some means to provide an education for your children. It was up to you to do it. And there was only 52,240 souls in the entire state, about the size of one large eastern city, and that was the entire state of Arkansas. Nevertheless, we attained statehood in 1836 along with our sister state, Michigan. At that time, as part of the compromise over slavery, Arkansas came into the state with Michigan, Michigan being a free state and Arkansas allowed to be a slaveholding state. We were the 25th state and 25th star, and this flag is I believe it's one of the original real flags, not just a replica of that flag that existed for only 1 year, the year 1836, because in July 4th, 1837, another star was added for Michigan, which came in just slightly after us. There was much celebration when this auspicious, when this happened. Ambrose Sevier, the territorial delegate to Congress, arrived in Little Rock from Washington on July 4th, 1836, and it was written of it that his entrance into our little city was quite apropos. He found our whole population in their holiday colors, just commencing a brilliant illumination of the town, and amidst the festivities and public rejoicing for our admission into the Union, an event in which he bore the leading part as one of the benefactors of our great state. I thought it was interesting. I see several references in old historical articles about illumination. It seems to be a unifying theme at the time. They would light up every building, every lamp. They didn't have many street lights in 1836. They might have had a few, but they would have been oil lamps. They did bonfires and would light up the night sky, and they were partiers. We have nothing on our ancestors. They loved a good party as much as we did, and the festivities continued far into the night, finishing up over at the local hotel. Also on July 4th, One year later, on the dawn of July 4th, 1837, residents awoke to be saluted with 13 guns to the old states by Captain Albert Pike's company of artillery, and at sunset with another 26 rounds. And the festivities closed with a ball at the Jeffries Hotel. And so it is. They like their loud noises and they like their fireworks too. An election was held on August 1st, 1836, and James Conway was elected the first governor of the state of Arkansas. Archibald Yell was elected to Congress as Arkansas's representative. And those were the sole two offices that the people were to elect. All the other offices were appointed by the state legislature, state assembly. The assembly appointed Ambrose Sevier and William H. Fulton as the first senators to the U.S. Congress in a joint session of the state and House. I thought that was interesting. Even though William Fulton argued extensively that we're not ready, he was still a popular enough politician to get appointed as senator. Even so, we're off to a start, and I'll spend just a few minutes on a little story that I think every Arkansas school child learned, well, at least in the old days, about, which was that on December 4th, 1837, Representative Major J.J. Anthony of Randolph County was killed on the floor of the State House with a Bowie knife by House Speaker John Wilson of Clark County. Tempers were running high, and this particular argument grew out of some vitriol over the real estate bank. The real estate bank is thought was just to be a benefit to the large landowners of the state who could post their land as collateral and take out large sums of money to expand their operation. It was thought that it shorted very much the working class people and the small farms of the uplands. There was harsh words on the floor. Speaker Wilson said, "Sit down." Major Anthony refused. Wilson advanced on him, drew a Bowie knife. Both men drew knives. At the last minute, somebody shoved a chair between them. Anthony threw down his knife and grabbed the chair to thrust it at John Wilson. John Wilson threw the chair up into the air and run him through with his Bowie knife. A very unfortunate early scene, but I think it also is illustrative of the fact that it was still in 1836 a very wild place and still very reminiscent of those early territorial days. Governor Pope said it was horrified by it and wrote of it. Albert Pike wrote a little poem. To make matters worse, I mean, in my mind anyway, there was a trial and there was an acquittal of murder. How, I don't know. After something like that, some charge didn't stick, but it didn't happen. Albert Pike was involved in that trial and also was equally horrified and wrote a little poem. He was a poet, among many other things. But his little ditty was, "And a jury set right with $1 or $2, and no justice is blind, yet a way you may find to open her eyes with $1 or $2. You see, after that acquittal, there was a change of venue to take the trial out of Pulaski County, so it was moved to Saline County. John Wilson bought all the jurors and all their buddies drinks at the local dram shop, the local bar, all night long. And revelers were in the streets, openly taunting the family of Representative Anthony. It was a horrid thing, and it's something, that you'd like to forget, but nevertheless, it is part of Arkansas history. And now I'm wrapping it up finally. I hope I didn't talk too long and lose too many of you, although I see I've only got a few left here. I hope you enjoyed it. Arkansas may not have been ready yet for what was to come, but I think we've done just fine. I think I'm just amazed at how nice our little city of Little Rock is. It's still a little city, but it's still a fine little city and a wonderful place to live. Many of the shortcomings I cited just a slide or two ago were overcome. Arkansas has seen very steady population growth from the beginning to the present. We have constructed our many different public institutions. We have railroad systems. We have road systems. We seem to have made it after a very rough and very difficult start. We got a slow start, but I'd say we've been picking up speed ever since. And much like our forefathers and their numerous references to doing an illumination of the entire town, I would say we still have a little bit of a fascination with illuminating the entire town, wouldn't you? And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael. We did have a question come in And even though we're nearing about an hour, I figure we can take a few questions. If anybody has one, if you could just please type it into the chat box. And Jim Metzger asks, was the sister state process common before the Civil War, or was the Michigan-Arkansas connection in some ways special?
I believe that I'm no authority on this, but I believe that if you go back and look through the records, there were multiple states that were admitted in that matter, leading all the way up to the Civil War. I think 6 states total were paired in that manner.
I don't see any. Oh, here's one. Okay, he's just replying to Jim.
Oh, I didn't mean to go on too long. I hope I didn't. Sometimes they get me started and it's hard to turn me off.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank
if
you,
I don't
everyone.
If I don't get another question, I guess we can close this event up.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and we update our website and our Facebook page on future events. So I hope you'll be able to join us again.
Thanks, everybody.